Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have Steve Edwards.
Oh, AJ's here, so I can't use the yo, so I'll just say hello from a still cloudy and rainy Portland, but for those of us skiers, we're still getting snow up in the mountains, blowing pretty hard, so it's great for late spring skiing.
Yeah, it was wet here, and then when I was driving my daughter to school, we saw a couple of vehicles with snow on them that must have come down out of the canyon or something. We also have AJ O'Neill. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, when you get up above, start to where you climb up Mount Hood towards Timberline, it's immediate change, and you're still getting blowing snow.
Nice.
It's crazy. It's great for skiing. I was up yesterday. It was awesome.
Nice. All right. We also have AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you from the fish room.
What's the fish room?
Fish room.
Yeah.
Is that an aquarium over there? Or?
Yeah, you can't really see it, can you? But
no, it's pretty small.
Yeah, so I've got like 10 aquariums in here right now. So during the long hiatus, I got into aquaria. That was my winter depression hobby.
Ooh,
the age of
that reminds
aquarium?
me, AJ, I got a pick for you. I got a great pick for you when we get to picks.
Excellent.
Right. Are you an Aquarius? Is that one of the signs, or am I just making that up?
No, it's actually aquarium. No, I'm kidding. Yes, it's Aquarius.
A person who's into aquaria is an aquarist.
Wow, things I never needed to. I mean, we also have Dan Shapir.
Hello from a warm and sunny Tel Aviv, which somehow didn't prevent me from getting this really bad cold for the entire week.
You do know that getting a cold has nothing to do with temperature, right?
Yeah,
That's not true. That's
well,
not
it
true.
has to do with changes in the weather, I think. Like certain changes make you more susceptible.
Yeah, it's stress to your body. When the temperature swings, or when you're cold for a long period of time, your immune system dips. So bacteria and viruses that are all around you that weren't affecting you then suddenly affect you.
Okay.
Also,
It's
I became
indirect,
allergic to the earth, by the way, since last time we spoke. I have allergies now. First time
The entire
in my life.
planet?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I wake up in the morning. Well, actually, it hasn't been so bad. It is like 3 weeks or so. I wake up in the morning, my eyes were itchy, and sneeze. Oh, it was terrible.
Well, it's getting close to hay fever time, which is what I get. Although here it's been so wet that it's keeping everything down. But this is about the time of year that I get hay fever.
I get that too, except that the rain that we get is like the light rain that you get. So it's just enough to make everything bloom like crazy.
Right. Yeah.
So I haven't had a cold, but I've had a lot of that, what AJ's complaining about for the last few weeks. So I live on my Zyrtec. I have it at my desk because I just take it as soon as I sit down.
I know what you mean.
Anyway, I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. This intro is taking forever, so I'm just going to skip all the pleasantries. Go check out javascriptgeniuses.com. And we have a special guest this week, and that is Lazar Nikolov. Did I get anywhere close?
That was all right. Yeah, it's Lazar Nikolov. And thanks for having me.
That's what I meant to say.
You were close. You got the syllables right, just in the wrong pronunciation.
Yeah. Anyway, we brought
you still awake?
Sentry.
Lazar, after listening to all that, or was that just so entertaining that you're on the edge of your seat?
No, I'm all right.
Okay, good.
Yeah, all the back and forth. Matt Henderson from Sentry recommended that we have you on, talk about web performance stuff and maybe some of the stuff that Sentry provides. And so, yeah, do you want to just fill us in on what else we need to know about you? We had a long discussion about Macedonia before you jumped in. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, Matt, for recommending me. Thanks, bud. But yeah, I'm Lazar Nikolov. I am a part of the DevRel team here at Sentry, and I'm all about web performance. That's my main focus.
Very cool.
Cool. I really love web performance. I dig it.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm a little curious just as we get into this, and Dan fills us in periodically. It's like, hey, there's this thing. But what kinds of things are you focused on at Sentry as far as making people's web apps more performant or more user friendly, or whatever it is that you're working on these days in the web performance arena?
Yeah, so I'm focused on the educational parts, and not necessarily just Sentry educational part, but just like in general, how to develop good developing habits, so your performance is in order. Basically, that's all I do.
But
So
you know what?
Oh, go ahead.
If maybe I do want to direct us first at slightly a different direction, because we have been speaking about performance a lot on this podcast of late,
Mhm.
but we've not spoken about Sentry in a while. I mean, we've had some people from Sentry, like I think like a year or two ago, but maybe some of our listeners somehow are not familiar with who Sentry are or what Sentry is and what it
That's
brings
fair.
to the table. So maybe we should actually start a little bit talking about Sentry before we then go talk specifically about Sentry and performance.
Yeah, sounds good.
Should I go for it?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So, for those of you who don't know, Sentry is an error monitoring and APM solution for any of your web apps and mobile apps, and I don't know, desktop apps and anything basically. So what it does is it offers, I would say that the best in class error monitoring. Every time something wrong happens in your app, you get an email, you get a Slack message, you get a Teams message if you're there. You get paged if you're on pager duty. You get a ticket in Jira, etc., etc. You just get annoyed basically from all the sites, and that's just for the error monitoring. Aside from just telling your app's on fire, you also get a whole bunch of cool and useful information like hardware info, software info, what the user is, if you have configured tracking users, etc. Yeah, all you need in order to fix the bug. So that is the error side, and there's also the performance side, or just in general APM, because there's more than just performance. You get monitoring for web vitals, networks, resources, traces, which are becoming like a central part at Sentry right now. And yeah, it's a tool that you install in your application, whatever the SDK is. We pretty much have support for all of them, and it lets you know and when something bad happens, and it keeps your performance in order. That's basically what Sentry is.
So first of all, you use the acronym APM. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, it's application performance monitoring.
Cool.
Yeah, it's basically
Now,
continuously.
Yeah, it's continuously what? Sorry.
Yeah. It's basically continuously measuring and reporting metrics such as web vitals and um, what else? Yeah, like I mentioned, resources that your website is pulling in, network requests that the app is triggering, etc.
Now,
Yeah,
if
I've
we
seen it.
start with the legacy stuff. Sorry, Chuck. You were starting to say?
I was just going to say, when you asked what it measured, I mean, we keep hearing web vitals. We talked a lot about that, but I've also seen them track other things, right? So Core Web Vitals is usually used for SEO. You can go listen to the handful of episodes we've done, but I've also seen it track how long certain function calls take, or on the back end, how much time it's taking to access the database and execute queries and things like that, or how long this request took to a backend or an API or things like that. So it's more than just Web Vitals, but a lot of the business folks, that's what they're going to care about. They're going to care about how performant is it, and does it match the Web Vitals so that we can show up higher in the list on Google.
Although, to be fair, and I keep saying that, I mean, on the one hand, it's a really good thing that Google made performance or Core Web Vitals a ranking signal, because it really pushes the entire industry to improve that aspect of websites and web applications. But the reality is that the impact on ranking in most cases is not that massive, to be honest. It's often considered to be a tiebreaker rather than a decider. Like the big aspects of ranking are still things like, content. Content is king. So whether it's relevant content, and also authority, like, if you're going to ask something related to health or medicines, then the CDC or something like that will come up first, and for good reasons. Or if you ask something about the news, then CNN will likely appear high in the search results, even though their performance is historically atrocious, because it's more about those aspects. But
Right.
first of all, it still is important because it can be a tiebreaker. But more significantly than that, it actually has significant impact on user experience once they're in the page or in the website. And lots of research has shown that when performance is poor, bounce rate is high. And conversely, that when performance is good, then conversion is high. So there's definitely a significant motivation to improve that. But again, I want to pull us back a little bit because, again, Sentry has historically been known for the error tracking and monitoring. I think that's still what most people think about when they think about Sentry. So I do want to talk a little bit about this before we dive into performance, if we can. Per my understanding these days, Sentry is kind of full stack. It does both the front end and the back end and provides a holistic view of all this information together. Is that a correct summation?
Yeah, basically, when you have multiple projects in Sentry and you use Sentry's SDKs to connect them, you automatically get a distributed trace. You can start looking at the front end and then move on to the back end and database and then go back, whatever your operation flows are configured.
And again, per my understanding, Sentry is something that I can install effectively for free on premises, or I can use kind of your hosted server, which then I have to pay for. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's free, so it's self-hosted. Yeah.
So when I self-host it, it's free, and I think it's also, or at least partially open source.
It's like it's source available. Yeah. So the license is not MIT. We came up with our own, but that's just for like protecting other businesses from piggybacking on Sentry and repackaging it. But it is, it's source available.
So if I have like an error in my JavaScript, something that would get written to the console, or an Ajax call that fails for some reason, an uncaught promise rejection, an uncaught exception, so on and so forth, all of these things are collected and then exposed to the site owner through the Sentry management console, effectively, if I again understand correctly.
Yeah. So like every SDK has a DSN configured, which is basically a link to where your instance is running. If you're self-hosted, you're going to have your own URL there. So that basically tells the SDK whatever you capture and measure, send it over there. Yeah. So when you're on premise, the data is on your servers.
Understood. And one of the things that I recall that I really liked about Sentry was the fact that it was smart enough to group errors together. Like one of the problems with a lot of these monitoring solutions is that you could literally drown in a sea of errors because, let's face it, so much stuff is getting collected and reported. So you don't want to have to sift through tons and tons of logs and errors and stuff like that. You want the system to aggregate the results and then just show you, this is something that's important. This is something that you should look at. So that's one thing that I recall about being really powerful with Sentry. And another thing that I recall being really powerful with Sentry is the amount of information that was exposed that could help you. Okay, there's let's say, an uncaught promise rejection. why? Like, what is this promise? What's the value that it's trying to get? So all this information is also surfaced to you as the website or web application owner.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you get all of those information attached to the issue itself. We don't call them crashes or anything. We just call them issues. So like it's all there. Yeah.
So how then did you actually pivot into performance? I mean, if you had this focus on errors and collecting errors and reporting errors, where's this sudden focus on performance? Where did it come from?
I'm not sure, to be honest, because I think there was like a few years before I started in Sentry, but I think it was natural. We got we had errors, we had tracing, and with tracing you can identify all the performance bottlenecks. There's also profiling, which taps into the whole, like connects into the whole uh, tracing and performance topic. So I'm not sure like what is the exact moment that prompted Sentry to start looking into performance. But we just know that performance is super important.
When you say tracing, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, we mean like tracing the operation flow for a specific operation. That can be, I don't know, a checkout flow or a login flow. So as functions execute and API calls get executed, tracing is basically putting little breadcrumbs along the
Mm.
way and then capturing the whole path of the operation flow, so you can see what where the operation flow went in I don't know what microservice and how long it took for each of the functions or whatever you have defined or instrumented.
So sort of like
So
a stack trace then is with
exactly.
variation.
Yeah, stack trace is like the snapshot of the stack at that specific moment, but tracing is more of a it's like on a timeline basis where the operation went. So, for example, if we start at the front end, we could have some spans, and spans are how spans are the things that we use to define the trace, right? So we basically create a trace, and the SDK automatically does it for you. But let's say we just create a trace, we get a trace ID, and then we uh, sprinkle around spans which are connected to the trace, but those define what happens at a specific moment. So instead of just console log, I am here, or console log, we reach this point, you're basically creating spans which also have a starting point and ending point. They have tags. You can put tags in them, etc. And those don't just stop at the I don't know, front end. You could send the trace header to the backend and continue the trace on the backend. So then when you want to debug how a certain operation behaved or like what happened, you see one timeline that combines the data from the front end and the backend, or your backend. If your backend is a microservice architecture, then you'll just have the data from all of the microservices there on one timeline, let's say.
So a question about that. Is it kind of like open telemetry traces?
Pretty much, yeah. And we also have an OTel adapter, so you could use the OTel instrumenter to get the data and then send it to Sentry as well. There is
what is OTel?
operability. Sorry,
OTel. What is that?
That's open telemetry. That is
okay.
Yeah, that's an open source standard, I would say. There's also
Standard
like
and implementation, I think.
Yeah.
It's both.
And implementation and tooling around instrumenting parts of your application.
Basically, think about if you want to like have a mental image of what is meant by traces, as Lazar described them. It's kind of similar to what you see in the performance tab of the Chrome DevTools. Like, so it's kind of, or like what is often known as a flame chart. You kind of see each of those traces are like one of the levels in the flame chart. So you have like a span that starts and ends when a certain operation takes place from the beginning to
Mhm.
the end of that logical operation. But within that, you have spans. So you could think of a function. So you have a span for the execution time of that entire function, but it calls sub-functions, and they have their own spans within that span. So you can like go through like the execution. So it's like stack trace over time, as it were.
Okay.
And it's now you collect this for like every session, or like is it sampled, or how does it work?
Yeah, there is a sampling configuration already put into the SDK, so you can play around with the values. It's basically just from 0 to 1. That's how Sentry configures it. So if you want
And
10% of your sessions to be sampled, then you just type in 0.1, so you don't burn
and the
out your quota.
sampling doesn't adversely impact the performance of the session, like the user doesn't notice it that it's being sampled in this way.
I wouldn't say so, but depending on you. For example, if you're instrumenting everything, all the important and non-important bits and pieces in your application, then you'll probably see some performance overhead. But that's all in your control, basically.
Cool. So we were talking about the fact that you have this tracing mechanism, and from that you kind of moved into also performance monitoring.
Yeah, because the trace contains everything, right? The trace knows where the application went or the operation went and how long it took, so we can identify performance bottlenecks. But then what we do at Sentry as well is whenever an error happens, we attach it to the trace. So you can see on that timeline, on the flame chart, you can see where an error happens and how the operation behaved after the error got triggered.
Hmm. Also, I assume how you actually got to that point of the error, because that's often
Yeah,
the thing you most want to know.
exactly. Yeah, the spans will give you the information about what data was being handled and basically what happened leading up to the error.
Hmm. Uh, so do you have like something like can I literally see things like what like a sort of like um, what the user was actually even maybe seeing on the screen or stuff like that when the error happened, or
Yeah, we do. It's like a different sub product. It's called Session Replay, and it's just an integration that you need to install in your client-facing applications. Right now, it's just web, but we're coming up with support for mobile as well. So it's like DOM recording. It's not a screen recording, but it's basically records the DOM and sends
mm,
all the and sends basically the recordings along with the whole monitoring and capturing.
oh, that's enough. I mean, the DOM does represent what the user actually sees.
Yeah. And it's not just the
And
DOM. Like you also get the network request. You also get the console log,
mm,
or console error, or whatever you're outputting into the browser's console. It's like literally uh you have access to the person's computer.
mm,
That one question I have related to that is a lot of
Mhm.
times there's information, be it personally identifiable information or
Yeah,
passwords or things like that. I'm assuming that you can configure Sentry to screen all that out so it doesn't show up in the
yeah.
Sentry
It's
console.
we're scrubbing that out automatically, and that happens in both sides. For example, the SDK itself does some scrubbing, so there is no PII going through the wire. But then also before we start processing the data, there's a thing called relay, which takes in all the data and does additional scrubbing on the server side as well before we put it. And that's for the I think the self-hosted one has it, but then also the SaaS one also supports the scrubbing of the PII.
Mhm.
but it's configurable. For example, if you're tracing, if you implement tracing and you explicitly append PII in through the context or tags, whatever it is, it's going to be sent.
So you need to think about what it is that you're actually collecting. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, like out of the
Yep.
box, if you don't explicitly send data, it's not going to be sent. But if you're, configuring the context of the SDK to include the logged in user or whatever data you want to, attach to the context, then it's going to be sent. But out of the box, it's nothing gets sent basically.
So when you added RAM capabilities, and by the way, RAM in the context of performance is real user measurements, which means it's data from the field rather than synthetic data created in simulated environments. You mentioned that you obviously collect the core web vitals, which these days are LCP, largest contentful paint, CLS, cumulative layout shift, and INP, which is input.
Interaction to next paint.
Interaction to next paint, exactly. I've been, like I said, had a head cold. I'm still recovering. But what other performance data are you collecting that's relevant to identifying performance bottlenecks in the application?
Yeah, so there's also database monitoring. So whatever you use, if Sentry has an integration for your database driver, there's a built-in for Postgres. There's also for Prisma if you're using Prisma. But if not, there's a way you can manually attach the query and also the result in the span itself when you're instrumenting. So there's also database monitoring, or like monitoring the queries as well. Yeah, aside from the web vitals, we also measure all of the resources that your page is pulling, any JS files, CSS files, if they're blocking or not, images as well, how big they are, like is there like a way to opportunities for you to optimize them, etc. So there's quite a um, quite some data getting pulled into the Sentry dashboards for you.
Cool. One of the biggest challenges with performance monitoring in the field, or RAM, as I mentioned, is the concept of attribution, which basically means, let's say I have a bottleneck. My LCP, largest contentful paint, is high, which means it takes a long time for the primary content to be displayed from the session start, which is fine and good, but I want to understand why it happens and what I should change. Or even potentially more challenging, the new metric, INP, interaction to next paint, has to do with how often the main thread is blocked by, for example, running JavaScript code. But there might be a lot of different JavaScript code that is running inside the context of my session. Could be first-party code. It could be third-party code, for example, various tag managers, pixels, and whatnot. So, and I want to understand, which one is the one that's causing the most harm, the most damage. And that requires some sort of mechanism of attribution. So, how do you go about that?
Yeah, so I feel like you have all the tools to fix all these things. For example, if you're looking into INP, then maybe capturing a profile and looking at a profile of your running application can actually shed some light on what is happening in the background and why your website is experiencing INPs at the time of interacting with the element.
So it's not profiling on the developer's machine. It's not like opening the Chrome DevTools and running the profile tab. It's actually collecting profile profiles
yeah.
for the actual real user sessions.
Exactly. Yeah, it's configurable. Yeah, you can also pull in profiles and use them to debug INPs or whatever it is. Yeah.
So can you give us like a concrete example? I'm sure that you worked with various customers on that. So without naming names, can you like give us an example of like an interesting case that you ran into and were able to debug in this way?
I don't work with customers, so I can't give you like yeah, I can give you examples from my demos that I create.
Go for it.
But yeah, I usually just use a trace view because the trace view basically tells me everything I need to know in terms of how the page loads or in terms of how my operations, my custom operation flows are behaving because I define them in my apps. Um, but basically that's how I go about debugging any of the like the top level stuff. But then as I mentioned, like if I have DB problems, I'll just use the queries product. And the idea is that it's all here. It's all connected to the same data, and on the sidebar you have all of these tools that we're talking about, and it's all connected to the same trace.
And what about integrations with various development environments? Like, let's say I'm using, I don't know, Next.js or Nuxt or Remix or whatever. There are like a million frameworks out there, Astro.
Mhm.
What kind of integrations do I get? Are you just looking at it as it's JavaScript and the web, but it's all the same? Or or do you have like specific integrations for the different frameworks and meta frameworks?
Yeah, we do have specific integrations with all of the different frameworks, and a lot of them that are currently out there, people that are using or not using. Uh, we do that because we want to tap into the framework itself or the library or the tool, whatever it is. We do that because we want to utilize the functionalities that the tool itself is providing when it comes to either instrumenting or monitoring for errors, etc. So a lot of the um, let's say we're talking about instrumenting, right? We're talking about tracing. A lot of the operations are already going to be instrumented because we tap into the tool itself, and also connecting the clients or the uh, projects, I would say. You don't really care about that as well, because when one project makes an API or a request in any way to a different one, we can also, the SDKs will automatically create that trace for you. So a lot of the times it's enough to just install Sentry in all of your projects, set up the SDKs, and you'll get a lot of data already configured and ready for you. But if you want to get into more details, then you do the tracing, basically. But Web Vitals, it's automatic. Session replay, you just need to add the integration. The tracing is covered as much as the framework can cover, but if you have more details, or like if you want to trace into a greater detail, then you can always supplement the trace with additional spans.
By the way, out of curiosity, do you use like the built-in browsers, performance.mark and performance.measure, or do you have like your own wrappers for the spans?
In some places we do, but we usually use, for example, for Core Web Vitals, there was this uh, JavaScript library, and I think it was from the Google Chrome team.
Yeah.
We use that under the hood to capture the data.
Okay. What are things that you are I don't know if you can answer that if you're not primarily working with customers, but what are the things that you're seeing as the most common sources of performance issues with people who are using Sentry for monitoring?
Yeah. Well, I've talking with people, I've noticed that there's a lot of undefined errors. For example, in JavaScript land, where you're trying to access a property of an undefined variable or object, you get the undefined error. That is pretty much the most common one. And also like fail to fetch errors not happening because of, I don't know, the URL doesn't exist or something like that. I've seen it that way too many times, maybe.
Yeah, but those are general errors. I'm
Mm.
asking what sort of performance related issues are you primarily seeing?
Hmm. I don't think I can. There's a lot of N+1 when it comes to like API requests and also DB queries. What else? I don't know. No, I haven't seen. I haven't been exploring too much of the customer data.
I'm seeing from an interesting split between two types of issues.
Mhm.
Like there's the issues related to, let's say, largest contentful paint or LCP, which are about how quickly a website loads.
Mhm.
And that's not always interesting for all web applications. I mean, it's interesting if you're building an e-commerce website, but if you're building some sort of a dashboard or something like that, or you're sitting behind authentication, then you don't care about it as much. Basically, LCP is really important when your page is ranked. If your page is not getting scanned and ranked, then you often don't really care as much about that. And in these days of server-side rendering (SSR), it's often not even the LCP may not even be dependent on the performance of database calls. So that's like one category of performance that I'm saying, which has to do with how well have I configured my CDN? How well have I configured caching for my files? Am I using properly optimized images? Am I properly loading my fonts and CSS and stuff like that? So that's like one category of performance issues that I see. And the other, which is one that you kind of mentioned a couple of times, has to do with once that web application is already loaded, how well does it respond to the various operations that I, the user, do inside of it? In which case, it is often has to do with like when a certain operation is performed, how many AJAX calls does it get translated into? How are these called parallelized or are they sequential? If they hit the database, which they often are, how optimized is that database query, for example? Like, have I properly created the indexes for the SQL query that I'm performing? Stuff like that. So these are kind of like the two categories of performance issues that I'm primarily seeing. Does that kind of match your understanding?
Pretty much, yeah, yeah, and that's how we're also building the product to help developers with these two types of issues.
Okay. So if we're going to the talking about the database issue, so you said you've got integrations with the major database providers or database platforms. Will it work like with any backend that I might have? Is the integration at the database layer, or does it need to be some sort of, I don't know, we support Node but we don't support Go? I don't know.
Yeah, we do that through the backend, I would say. But it depends on what is the driver that is being used to access the database. So we're not basically monitoring the database server or instance itself, but how the client that uses the driver to query the database from that point of view. So it matters if there is if there is support for the client itself or the backend framework or technology. That is the first thing, and then the second thing is what driver does the backend use to query the database for data. So that is the second thing.
So which backend technologies do you support?
Oh, a lot. We have Node, we have Django, and anything Python. We have PHP stuff
I,
like Laravel, etc.
I've used it with Rails.
Rails, yeah. A lot of the I would say all the most the famous ones or like the most popular ones.
JVM, I would assume, probably.
Yeah, there's like Java stuff. Yeah, I don't know all of them, but there's like too many.
Yeah, just for what it's worth, my company uses Sentry on a pretty huge Laravel and Vue site. We use it pretty intensely, both for see our both Laravel and Vue errors, JavaScript errors, bundling errors, and any number of different errors from both ends of the application. So it's very handy.
Do you also use it for performance monitoring?
Not so much. I think we have some other tools we use. We use it mostly just for the error tracking. And we get that, like he mentioned earlier, where he's talking about it being annoying. We get the emails and the Slack channel updates and all that kind of stuff. So
I think the key thing from my perspective, thinking about making the web faster, what I like about this is there are a lot of websites that are using Sentry. Like Sentry has become, from my perspective, almost a de facto standard for error tracking and error monitoring in on the web today. And if some of these organizations that are using Sentry already have some sort of a RUM tool in place, then good for them. But if they don't, then why not just use Sentry to get all this performance information and start making your website faster?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen clients that only uses for error monitoring to also implement our performance tools, whether they have or don't have already other tools in place. So I've seen them move towards Sentry as well.
Yeah, I've seen that on a few other places and with other competitors to Sentry. That either went from, hey, we do the APM or the application performance monitoring, and then they added the error stuff or vice versa. But yeah, effectively people start using one part of the tool, and then when they run into some issue, right? So it'll come up that, hey, our core vital scores are not where we want them, right? Because that got on the radar and they checked it out. Or hey, we've got this page that just takes forever to load, right? And so then they figure out, oh, we've been putting all this data into this system for a long time, and so now we have it, and so now we're going to go look at it. And so then they start to audit what's going on in their website. And I think that's one thing that's kind of nice. So the tool that I use for most of my websites for error monitoring does not have an APM component to it. And yeah, there have been a couple of times where I've looked at things and gone, man, I really need something to, pull this piece out. And so, yeah, it's really convenient to have them both there.
Another thing is a lot of site owners and SEOs, especially SEOs, they look at the Google Search Console. And the Google Search Console, you do have a Core Web Vitals area within it. So they can see like performance issues that they have with various pages in their website. The problem with it is that the Google Search Console has like this 28-day smoothing window. So you often
Yeah.
see issues like 2 to even 3 weeks after they've actually started. So you say, hey, I've got a problem, but it's affecting your website it's been affecting your website for 2 to 3 weeks already. So that's problem number one. And then you make a fix. It then takes another 2 to 3 weeks to actually see that the fix actually impacted. So yes, you can tell Google Search Console, like, I made a change, please review it. but it's still a chore. So that's problem number one. And problem number two is, I mentioned before, is this whole issue of attribution. So you can see that in a certain page or group of pages, I don't know, CLS has gotten worse. But like, why?
Mhm.
What's caused it? What change have we made over the past 3 weeks? And there can be so many things. It might be somebody from marketing who just made some sort of change in the page layout or content. It might be, I don't know, issues with an improperly configured CDN, or maybe you misconfigured your webpack or whatever, and you're creating much larger bundles, or maybe somebody in marketing added another pixel, and it could be so many things that can have the impact. And this whole concept of getting good attribution, of understanding as quickly as possible where the problem is really key to being able to resolve it. And that's where a tool like Sentry and like the other RUM providers, at least the good ones, can provide so much value over what Google gives you out of the box.
I was just going to say, because you were listing examples, and when you mentioned added a pixel, that's the one that I've seen come up. But the trick is that a lot of times that doesn't show up in your code because you're using something like Google Tag Manager or something. And so, right, the change isn't in the code base, the change is in the tool. And so just be aware of what you're allowing to modify your page that may or may not be the code.
Exactly. I mean, you see that, let's say you've pinpointed the time of the degradation, and then you start doing, let's say, a git bisect, and you find that
Mhm.
nothing's changed
Right.
because it's not in your code. Like you said, it might be that somebody in marketing using Google Tag Manager just added another, pixel that's really killing your performance, but again, totally not reflected in your code base.
I've also seen cases where a parallel happens. So it's not just from this point on, or like from this commit on, then the performance gets worse. But like there's like two parallel lines where one group of the users are experiencing okay, are having an okay experience, but then another has not so much okay, and it didn't have anything to do with pixels or stuff like that. It had to do with the state of the application. So I've seen like banners
Mhm.
that change the LCP score because they're pretty big at the top, and some users take the time to hit the X button, but some don't. Right. So for some of the users, your RUM data is going to report the LCP is going to be based on the banner, but for the others, it's not going to be the element is not going to be the banner itself or the background or whatever it is, but it's going to be some different part of the page. So there's like also parallels of data.
And I've seen situations where a lot of organizations do all sorts of A/B tests.
Mhm.
So they might be testing different, let's say, head title or header messages, and the different header messages have a slightly different length. And then, due to wraparound and stuff like that, all of a sudden, a different piece of content is the largest contentful piece of content to be painted based on where you are in the A/B test. So all these things can really drive you nuts trying to figure out, hey, what's actually going on? Why is it that all of a sudden my page shows poor performance, even though I didn't think that anything actually changed? And again, attribution is really key in being able to solve these types of scenarios.
Yeah, and I would say that Sentry does handle that in a really good way. For example, in cases where an A/B test is happening, or in case where some of the elements or state of the application can affect the web vitals, you can always add tags to the context. So all of the data that's being measured is going to be tagged, like a banner shown true or false,
Oh,
or if
that's
the
good to
user
know.
is logged in, yes or no, etc. So that based on the tag itself, you can filter out specific scenarios of the state of the application, and then you can zoom in that data and see how the I don't know, web vitals and all the other metrics look like without these cases in mind.
So it's not just desktop versus mobile or Chrome versus Edge. It's also, do I have this banner or don't I have this banner? Am I on this? Am I on the A part of the test or the B part of the test, and stuff like that?
Exactly, yeah. And you have you already have the tooling in the SDK and in the dashboard in Sentry to do all the slices that you need to do, so that the data makes sense.
Cool.
Yeah. So you said you haven't gotten into the customer data a ton. I'm kind of curious if there are case studies though where somebody basically demonstrated or had some kind of major shift in their performance or a major shift in their web vitals or a major shift in, hey, this was our moneymaker page and it got faster and then we made more money. I don't know which of those you might be aware of, but that would be cool to hear about.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, we internally, and like, we always talk with the customers, and there's sometimes we even do events like workshops where we just gather gather our people in Zoom, and we talk with our clients or people who use Sentry. I remember I also did one with a person who used Sentry in a React Native application, and we talked about their experience, etc. So we sometimes we do publish these kinds of interactions and conversations, either through video format or on our blog. So there are some stuff like that. Yeah.
How do I find those?
I'm not sure if there's like one page that lists all of them, but if there isn't, then that's a really good idea, and I'm gonna take it up and see if we can build it. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe either the blog or the YouTube. There's probably a playlist on the YouTube channel.
Okay. Any of the rest you have questions, or should we go to picks?
I've covered my bases. Lazar, is there anything else that you specifically want to add?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think we had a really good discussion around tracing and performance and stuff.
Cool. I have to say, just to conclude, that I'm a huge believer in real user measurements. You're always surprised if you just go by synthetic measurements. It's highly likely that you're not actually testing what your users are really experiencing. So that's number one. And number two is that production will always surprise you.
Mhm.
And I've seen things. So just trying to rely on synthetic tests and simulated environments, that's just not enough.
Yeah.
You
Have you seen the report? I think it's a few years old, but there was a report where it got all of the lighthouse data and got all like the top, I don't know how many websites with their scores, and then mapped them out with their data from the Crux database. And it turned out that like 43% of uh, good lighthouse scores don't even meet the minimum of the web vitals when from the Crux database.
That's interesting. I've often seen the reverse, like pages that actually have good core vitals, but seem not to have good
Lighthouse.
simulated scores, especially
Hmm.
for mobile, because Google really simulates a low-end device that's slower in many cases than what users often actually have.
Yeah.
But the reverse can also happen. I know that Rick Viscomi from Google, I think, actually even wrote an article a while back about why these scores can be so different and why you might see such significant discrepancies between the synthetic tests and the real user measurements. So yes, I think that the best option is really to use both. That during the development cycle, you're using the synthetic tools to make sure that you don't degrade before pushing to production. But then you also have tools monitoring your production environment to catch all the things that slip through, because inevitably things will slip through. And like we said, changes might be as results of things that have nothing to do with the actual code. They might have to do with pixels, with images. I've seen, for example, cache headers for files misconfigured.
Mm-hmm.
So, or I've seen situation where somebody accidentally turned off all the compression for all the files at the CDN. So you suddenly are downloading, 5 times as much data than before. So I've seen so many reasons for poor performance that might not be caught by synthetic tools that only check during build times.
I guess you could say really say, based on the report, that was the crux of the issue, right?
Yeah, I think you made the same joke when we had Rick Viscomi on the show.
Hey, if it works, keep using it.
Some people hadn't heard it yet. So.
That's right.
Sorry.
All good. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the picks. Before we do that, though, Lazar, how do people find you on the internet if they have questions or want to chat or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I try to keep a consistent username, but let me just change it real quick so everyone can see it. It's at Nikolov Lazar, and this is how it looks like.
All right. We'll also put that in the comments on our various streaming platforms, and if I can type it, and in the show notes as well. And that way people can look you up. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do the picks. Steve, do you want to start us off with picks?
Going for the high point early again. Okay, I can appreciate that. So before I get to the dad jokes of the week, AJ, I had mentioned earlier that I thought of a pick. You inspired me of a pick when we were talking about your aquariums. Back in the 80s, there was this comedian, and he was the king of puns. He was, I guess you could say, one of my idols. His name was Kip Adada. And he has a song called Wet Dream that is all about fish puns. And it starts out how he was driving in downtown Atlantis, and his Barracuda wasn't working, so he was driving a rented Stingray. Anyway, there's a great line in there where he's trying to pick up some hot fish in a bar, and he asks her, what's your sign? And she says, aquarium. And he says, great, let's get tanked. But anyway, that's an all-time classic. If you want to check it out, you can find it. There's actually a video, you can tell it's very early MTV video style on YouTube called Wet Dream. So the dad jokes of the week. I just lost them. Sorry. Stand by. Did you know, it turns out that if you can actually hear the blood flowing through your veins, you just have to listen varicose veins, varicosely. Sorry, I flubbed that one. Along the lines of the fish puns, what do you call a shrimp that is always getting injured? He's accident prawn. Right? And then finally, the other day I went to see my doctor about this issue I'd been dealing with, and he said, well, do you want to hear the good news first or the bad news? I said, good news, please. He says, we're naming a disease after you.
Yeah, you don't want that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's funny. There's in the fire service, they say, if there's a drill named after you, it's because something really bad happened, which is generally true.
All right. AJ, what are your picks? You are muted.
I think his first pick is the unmute button.
Where is it? Okay, I found it.
Yes, it is. Unmute.
Yeah. Let's see. I was just looking to find something to pick.
It's because he had no idea that we were going to have picks today.
right?
I had no idea.
Total
I had
surprise.
no idea. I was completely surprised.
shocked.
I was taken aback. Oh gosh, let's see. Well, this is not really a pick as much of a thing that happened. Okay, I got a couple. I saw the movie Being There. Steve, have you seen that movie?
Yes, that is such a weird movie. My when I was in college, one of my Spanish professors had recommended it. She really liked it. And I'm a huge Peter Sellers fan from the the Pink Panther movies, the Inspector Clouseau stuff that he done. But yeah, this Being There is just, it's interesting.
I don't know that it's interesting.
It's weird.
So it's critically acclaimed. It's on some lists of, best movies you got to watch, because my wife and I, we've watched all of the TV shows and movies that have come out in the last, 10 years that are worth watching, and there's not very many of them, and so like nothing new comes out. It's all, it's like very, very meh. And so we decided to go backwards to find some older stuff, some stuff that people really felt like had meaning, was done well. And we landed on Being There, and the reviews on it were so high. The trailer looks so weird, but the trailer was a very accurate depiction of the movie. It really made no sense. There was no plot. It was basically depicting someone who is semi-autistic / echolaliast, who just says a few things here and there and ends up like next to the vice president, essentially. But it was I don't know. So I don't know. That's just something that happened. But something that's good is I finished listening to the first book of The Expanse, and I have to say, overall, I do like the book better than the show. For the first half of the book, I think I like the show better, because the show gives a little bit more. It like with the Hunger Games, you only get a certain perspective in the book, but then in the movie, they get to tell you things that are going on in the rest of the universe that you can't see from the main character's perspective. In the book, they do have a couple main characters, but I guess where the second half of the book, I liked it better than the show, was that it's just much more focused. The show progressively got worse and worse as they tried to just make the characters more extreme, and just introducing more characters and then just having them yell louder and cuss stronger. And that kind of got old, but the book just stays focused on the few characters that are the important ones that drive the story, and doesn't try to introduce a bunch of others. And I mean, like, the book's got plenty of language and whatnot too, but it's not the same where it's just like, oh, she's on screen now, cue the F word. Yep, that was her line. Yep, okay, now we move on to the next character. Oh, his line is angry drunk. Got it. Okay, and we move on to the next character. In the book, at least for the first book, they develop the characters a lot better. And so I didn't think I was going to listen to the whole book series. I don't know if I will, but I am going to pick up the second book at some point. I've got a whole backlog of Audible to do. But and then last thing is, again, not really a pick per se, but just an experience. So while we were on the show here, I did try to get Sentry self-hosted installed. I ran into some Docker issues because, Docker. But I'm glad to see that it's available for self-install, and I'm glad to see that the install script can kind of resume when it hits a hiccup. I'll play with it a bit more and see if I can find like the right version of Docker to host on the right type of VM to actually get it to install, because I would like to see how that works. But the documentation looks pretty decent. I do wish that it had like just the scripts to run the installers without having to deal with Docker. Just say, okay, like, you got to use Debian for this. But if you use just tell me what the operating system is that Docker would have used. Let me install that operating system, and let me just like run the scripts without having to deal with Docker. Because Docker, man, it's such a pain in the butt, But but I'm glad to see that it's there, and I was trying it out, and the documentation looks good, and I like I said, I like that it's it seems to gracefully restart as you hit one issue. You can solve that and then restart the install again, and it'll pick up where it left off, and that's always very nice. So +1 to the Sentry self-hosted on that, and hopefully I'll get it all the way. And that's the end of my ramblings for today.
I just want to chime in on the Expanse stuff. Also, I'm just going to put it out there. I very much prefer the Docker setups to the other kinds of setups. But the Expanse in particular, you're going to find through the whole TV series and through the whole book series that your observation mostly holds out for all of the other books. A couple of things that bothered me a little bit is that so the books, some of the books are spaced out over years, right? So you have one book and then a bunch of stuff happens and then the next book starts. And a lot of times there's a novella that fills in the gaps. Some of the novellas aren't as good, but the other thing is that those gaps and the things that happen in those gaps are kind of important. And so the way that they try and shoehorn some of the plot points to keep it more or less continuous didn't really work. And so when they ended the TV series, they actually left off the last book and, a bunch of other stuff that I kind of wish they'd done. So anyway, but overall, they did an excellent job on the TV series. The other thing to keep in mind with the TV series is I think the Sci-Fi Channel did the first seasons.
First three. And then Amazon picked it up.
And when Amazon picked it up, it got better. So
I know there was one, like the first season of the TV series was pretty good, and then either the third or the fourth one was pretty good, but that's either, I think it was the second one was just like out of nowhere. It's like I don't know if the book's that way. I don't know. Is the book like a completely different, unrelated story for the second book?
No, I don't remember for sure, but no, I don't remember it being that. So
yeah, because they go into this thing about Mars, and then the humanoid aliens, and then that storyline is dropped and it's never picked back up again. So I don't know if that, like, if the book has that, or if that was just like they were padding the TV show.
The continuity, I remember the second season being mostly based on the second book, but yeah, the continuity in the books is really, really tight. So
okay, cool. Well, I'll look forward to the second one then.
Yeah. All right, Dan, what are your picks?
Okay, so I have a couple of picks today. My first, since we've been discussing performance and the impact of that performance can have on the success of a website, there's this excellent website for web performance that Google created. Well, web performance and web development, called web.dev. And they have a section there, web.dev/case-studies. We'll put the link in the show notes, obviously, but it's got a whole, lots of case studies of companies that improved their performance or certain aspects of their performance, and the benefits that they've gained as a result of these improvements, like actual numbers and actual testimonials and figures and stuff like that. So if you need to prove to your, let's say, management why it's worthwhile investing time, effort, and maybe money into improving the performance of your website or web application, you can go there and you'll find a lot of relevant content. So I think this is a useful resource in the context of what we've been talking about today. So that would be my first pick. My second pick, I've mentioned that we've been clearing up our library, and I found various books that I haven't read in a while, and was deciding which ones to keep and which ones to let go, basically donate, and also which ones to reread. I think I've mentioned before that I'm actually reading a series of books called The Saga of the Pliocene Exile. It's a series of books from the 80s written by Julian May. She was a sci-fi / speculative fiction author. It's kind of an interesting work in the sense that it's kind of midway between science fiction and fantasy. in that it's supposed to be like science fiction based, but it gives a lot of fantasy vibes. Um, but from my perspective, it's an excellent series of books. There are 4 books in the series. Since it's from the 80s, they're all written, so you don't have to worry about an incomplete series of books. It goes from start to finish. They're pretty thick, lots and lots of characters, lots of character development and character interactions, and it's just a great series of books, lots of action and adventure. But also, she uh, really gives like the flashes out the various characters. One complaint that I've heard about the books, and I can see where it's coming from, although I don't necessarily agree with it, is that the depictions of the LGBTQ, let's call it community, or people that are identify as such, especially trans people, is not ideal. It may have to do also when the books were written, but I'm just putting it out there in the case that might impact the decisions of some people to read it. As I said, I think the books are really good, but again, this is my own personal opinion. So that would be my second pick. And I mentioned them before. It's just that it's a long series of books, so it's taking me a while to read through them. And by the way, I I can't deal with audiobooks. I have to actually read the book. I don't know, when somebody's reading it out to me, it kind of feels weird to me. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but that's the way it is. So that would be my second pick. My third pick, I'm also very much a history buff or history fan, and especially of ancient history. And given the fact that I live in Israel, also history of the Middle East, which has a lot of history and a lot of ancient history. And I found these series of lectures called The Rise of Ancient Israel with Professor Israel Finkelstein. He's a professor of archaeology in the Tel Aviv University. He's done some of the most significant archaeological digs in Israel, certainly in recent years. And it's a very long series of conversations that he has with one of his students who's actually made this, basically recorded this series. There are 21 discussions, and they are like something like 40 something minutes long each. And they talk about how the evolution of the ancient kingdoms of Israel, of King David, and before and after. It's really interesting, and if you're into that, uh, I do have to caveat this with the fact that he takes the Bible as a serious source of historical information, but when there's a conflict between the story in the Bible and the archaeological findings in the field, he will side with the archaeological findings. Or put another way, he sees the Bible as not as a historical book so much as a book of, religious book, and an ideological book that is based on historical events. So,
Considering the archaeological veracity of the Bible is something I read up quite a bit too on. That's sort of unfortunate.
there's a lot of
unfortunate, but
historical veracity. He's not denying it, but again, when there are conflicts, and there are some conflicts between,
unresolved.
potentially, but the problem that he likes to state, that he says a lot about archaeology, is that you can only go by what you have found, and that maybe tomorrow you'll find something new that completely changes your point of view.
Yep,
But
that's very
but
true.
but again, you can only go based on what you found, and uh, while a lack of evidence is not an evidence, how does it go?
I know exactly what you're saying. Yes.
But still, if there's no evidence for particular events where you expect evidence to be abundant, it does say something, or at least it raises some significant questions. Anyway, I highly recommend it. It's an excellent conversation. I'll put a link to the entire playlist. If you're into that, very highly recommended.
Cool.
And my final,
That
sorry,
sounds really fascinating.
yeah.
I said, there goes my week.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I would be curious, as to what you get from it. It's really really informative. And my final, I won't call it pick, I'll call it a mention. Today is the Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel, and this one's especially hard because we still have 132 hostages being held in Gaza by Hamas. So it's kind of, I wouldn't call it a modern day Holocaust. It's not quite up there, but it makes everything harder. And we don't even know how many of them are still alive and how many of them have been murdered or tortured to death. And it's and you swing between hope and feelings of hopelessness, and it's really hard. So anyway, those would be the picks and mentions that I wanted to make for today. And over to you, Chuck.
All right, I'm going to put out my picks, and then we'll let Lazar do his. So I always start with a board game. In this case, I'm doing a card game. This one's called Hanabi. Hanabi is the Japanese word for fireworks. And the game's pretty simple. You are dealt a hand of cards. It's always 4 cards. You hold them facing everybody else. So you don't know what cards you have. You can see what everybody else has, but you can't see what you have. And then what you do is you can either play a card. So if you know what you have, or you think you have a good idea of what you have, then you can play the card. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get stacks of all the colors to go from 1 to 5. And there are 3 ones, 2 of 2, 3, and 4, and then 1 5 of each color. And so you can play a card, you can discard a card. So the way we always play is we always let everybody know I'm discarding off of the right hand side of my hand, right? So if people don't want you to get rid of it because it's a 5, and if you discard a 5, you lose because you can't play it then, right? Then people will clue you, hey, this is and so that's the last one, is you can give a clue, and a clue is these cards are white, or these cards are yellow, or you could do these cards are 2s, right? And so anyway, and then you have to kind of keep track of where stuff is in your hand without being able to see it. And so anyway, it's a super fun cooperative game. I like it better than a lot of the other cooperative games because like when I play cooperative games, there's one in particular that when I play with my wife, it's me and her and anyone else who's playing, and she's telling us all what to do. And I don't love playing the game where I'm watching somebody else play my game. So anyway, this one's different because you can't do that because you are missing information. So yeah, and we usually chit chat while we're doing it. You just have to be careful because if I'm holding my cards up and I know that I have a particular card, I may have inferred that from the clues I got and the fact that I can see the other player's hands. And so if you know what a card is, you can't always say, I know that this is the 4 of white, because you might have inferred that from the fact that they told you it was a white card, and from the discard pile and the other hands that, right, it can't be anything else. So anyway, super fun game. So you can buy it. It's like $10 on Amazon. And then the other picks I have a couple of them. So one of them is a movie that my wife and I saw last week or the week before. It's called Escape from Germany. And it's a true story about Latter-day Saint missionaries that were in Germany when the war started. And so, as you can imagine, they were somewhat hostile toward Americans, and they were also hostile toward missionaries because they were hostile toward certain kinds of religion. And so anyway, it's just this series of miracles on how they got all those missionaries out of Germany. And I really, really enjoyed it. So I'm going to pick that. It's done by T.C. Christensen, who's the guy that did The Other Side of Heaven. And so if you liked that movie or that brand of movie, then definitely check it out. And then the last pick I have, besides telling you to go check out javascriptgeniuses.com, is if you go to, so Brandon Sanderson last year, he put up a YouTube video and a Kickstarter and basically said, I was locked in my house during the pandemic, so I did what I do. I wrote all these books, but I didn't tell anybody about them. And so it's a series of books he's called The Secret Projects. And I listened to the first book on Audible. It's called Tress of the Emerald Sea. And I'll put an Amazon link on to the Audible book so you can buy it with a credit. But this one's part of the Cosmere. So he has a universe that he writes a number of his books in, and you can kind of see some of these worlds converging, right? Beginning to converge because you have crossover with some of the characters. Usually it's minor characters, not major characters. But anyway, this one is in that vein. The narrator of the book is Hoyd. If you've been following along with Brandon Sanderson's stuff, he wrote the whole thing in Hoyd's voice. And Hoyd is one of the main characters in this book. But it was a fun book, really fun book to listen to. So if you're into audiobooks, or if you want to just, I guess you can just pick up a copy of it. The Kickstarter, he mailed out a book every month along with a bunch of other stuff. But now you can go and you can get the books without being part of the Kickstarter. So a year later, right? So last year, if you backed Kickstarter, you got this book in January, and you got the next one in February, March, and April. And now the first 4 books are out because we've gone through April. And so I'm assuming that the 5th book in the secret book series is going to come out pretty quick here because we're into May. So anyway, I really, really enjoyed that book. So anyway, those are my picks. All right, Lazar, what are your picks?
A question: do the picks need to be non-technological, or
they can be technical or non-technical?
Okay, because I only got technical. I'm a
nerd. It's all good. I'm always into new stuff, and I'm starting to get into AI, so I'm going to start picking some of that stuff too.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So I didn't know that I needed to prepare picks, but something on top of my mind. I'm gonna mention Sentry, of course. Check it out. The free tier is generous enough for you to get started, and it's generous, so you should check it out. But when it comes to picks, I got one interesting, and that is a project by Joan Leon. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, but it's basically, and I'll drop the links here so you can check it out. It's basically a collection of web performance snippets that you can not install, but like move into your web browser, so you can, check out what is the LCP element or whatever it is that the snippet provides. There's also IMP. There's also a whole loading category, but it's basically at dev time before you commit what you have. If you want to check out how the performance looks like on your machine, you can check out all of these beautiful snippets. So these are at dev time. One more new thing that I came across, and Henri Helvetica told me about this, is the ROM archive. It's basically like Crux, but it's data taken from Akamai, and it's put together in a database where you can query it. And I haven't been playing too much with it, but it's basically you can use this database to see ROM data, and you can split it into different frameworks, etc. So can plug that in. And then also I've been playing with a project called UI.Aeternity. So it's a collection of UI components for React built with Tailwind and Framer Motion, and they look really good. And I tried using them, but some of them uh, are really making an impact on the performance. So I'm looking into these components right now and figuring out how I can, or if I can, make them a bit more performant, right? So instead of using framer motion, can we do that with plain CSS? So we're not introducing or shipping too much JavaScript to the client. So these are the things that are on top of my mind, and I would have been more prepared, but I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. Thanks for coming. This was a lot of fun. It's good to kind of dive into some of these tools that a lot of people use. I also found a lot of applicability for if people were using, like I said, things that are like Sentry but are not Sentry. Some of those features are there, some of them are not. But yeah, I think I have a much better idea in some of these areas, especially on the APM, the performance side, on what I can grab. So thanks for jumping in. And until next time, folks, Max out.